Welcome to our conference and the first morning panel. The topic will be European economic integration. We have four presentations, and we'll go by the order of the program. And our first presenter is Professor Tal Sadeh from Tel Aviv University. We'll talk about bank state capture and blame avoidance in the European Union. The floor is yours, 12 minutes.
Yes.
And I will enforce the time strictly.
Very well. Okay. I know. I'm trying to get full screen here somehow, but I'm not sure how this is done. So if any of you is familiar with this version of, I don't know. All right, forget that. We'll just share as is. Okay. So this presentation is about the relationships between governments and banks and the regulation of banks. And this is especially important in the European Union because the European Union has been through some major banking crisis in the recent decade. In fact, it's more than a decade now, the Euro crisis. But banking issues in Europe and in other places are not only a part of the Euro crisis, which made them very infamous, but also have been going on. And in fact, we keep having banking problems, say in Italy or in Spain, even without a major continental crisis. So I think, therefore, we need to study this issue, and the abstract is that as a response to the major crisis that unfolded in Europe in the early 2010s, Europe has embarked on a European banking union. The European banking union was supposed to correct a failure, it's a governance failure, whereby you had a single currency and free capital flows, which meant all of Europe was supposed to be a single banking market. But banking in general has failures because banks, if they are unregulated, have a short-term incentive to lend as much as they can, as lending has very little operational costs. And the more you lend, the more you earn in interests. But then when you're driven into competition with other banks, you start obviously with the safe customers and you soon start lending to those that are more risky. And banks are driven to hold low reserves because reserves are costly. And in other words, they're driving cars without brakes pretty soon. So this is why you generally need to regulate banks. Banks need this regulation for banking to be safe. But what happened in Europe is that they didn't have a single banking regulator. It was national. And because it was national, there was a intergovernmental competition about not restricting our banks from being competitive in other countries. If you're safe, you're less competitive because the brakes in your car have a cost. So there's an externality here, actually, a negative externality whereby you expect everyone else to be safe, but you'd like to free ride this. And so for as long as banking was national, governments could regulate their own banks. But when you had a combination of a single currency and free capital flows and national banking supervisors, this created regulatory arbitrage opportunities. And there was no single authority to supervise the whole continent, which is why they imposed or delegated this authority to the European Central Bank to be the single supervisory board. I'm not going to go into all the details of the European Banking Union, but the argument in this study that I'm conducting, is that one of the main reasons for which governments in Europe would like to have the SSB is simply blame avoidance. There's more literature on this topic that is about finding efficiency at a European level, but less about what really drives the incentive, and that is that you can blame someone else, and the expectation. There's a literature on blame avoidance in Europe, but not about banks. They haven't touched this, so I thought this would be some gap that I'd like to cover. And the hypothesis, so especially for governments that are not supposed to be friends of banks, like left-wing governments, then if there's a problem with banks, they'd like someone else to accept the blame. A strong Eurosceptic electorate, it always is convenient to delegate authority in that case to a European institution so that they can take the blame. This is a project, a work in progress. So the idea is to have a conjoint experiment among citizens, residents of Germany, where in order to find whether these hypotheses are true, because of the time limitation and because I've mostly explained the dilemmas here, I'm going to skip these slides. How much more time do I have? 5 minutes. Yeah. So what do voters want in this relationship? We've talked about banks and government. There's the concern of mutual capture because banks would like the governments to allow them to compete freely. The governments would like banks to lend them money, and banks would like the governments to bail them out when they're in difficulties. So there's a mutual capital. There's also the voter, that triangular relationship, and that has received less attention. The voters want also cheap and abundant credit. They want to have safe and stable banks. If there's a bailout, they don't want to pay for it. The government also has to consider its relationship with voters. So to explain our design that I haven't done this. It's actually all ready to go into a pilot experiment, but I have not been able to do this before this conference. The idea is in a conjoint experiment, it's a survey experiment. You recruit participants and then you confront them with a choice they have to make between two parties that are competing to get elected and to be in government. And each has its own traits, its attributes, but also in this setting, I'm doing something that is not conventional in conjoint experiments, and that is to introduce context to the choice. The context is also randomly assigned. All of these attributes are randomly assigned. Each time you get this question, there's a different combination of party traits. Sometimes they are in government, sometimes they're not. They are pro-Europe or anti-Europe. They are left or right-wing economically or socially. And then there's the question of, is banking supervision at the national level? That's part of the context. Is it at the national level? Is it at the European level? And they're also business cycle, randomly assigned business cycle situations. Are we in a prosperity or in some recession? And personally, is the respondents assumed to be in a hard place or not? So all of these features, attributes at the national level and at the party level are randomly assigned. And then the participants simply have to make a choice. It's a binary choice. Which of these two parties? They get two profiles. Which of these parties do you support? And this would be, of course, a binary variable. And once you have the results, you can analyze them with a regression, statistical regression, where the binary choice is the dependent variable. And all of these traits operationalized as dummies themselves are independent variables in this regression. And you can specifically create interacting dummies for the interesting cases of a party that is in government, it's an incumbent trying to get elected, with the combination of either supervision at the national level or at the European level. And through this, you can see whether the dependent variable being elected or being voted for a party is sensitive to whether the party has been in government while supervision was in its own place or given to the European level. And there's also, I may have not mentioned it, but crucially, there's also a randomly assigned event of bank bailout. And there too, there would be values of from the entire bailout was fully funded by taxpayers to the other extreme of the bailout was fully funded by the state. And we can, through interacting this variable too with those that I mentioned, we can actually test whether a bailout hurts an incumbent government, an incumbent party, when it was its own responsibility to supervise banks compared with when it was a European level. We can see whether that changes voters' attitudes. We do what we call heterogeneity tests because before the survey experiments, participants go through a questionnaire. It's a pre-experiment question size where they provide some information about themselves. It's anonymized, so they keep their privacy, but they can tell us if they are left or right-wing in their opinions, for example, if they are pro, anti-Europe. And we can then use this when we do the regression analysis to restrict observations to the categories of people being either left or right-wing, pro or anti-Europe, and see whether that makes heterogeneous effects, whether indeed, as with hypothesis 2 and 3, that makes a difference. We cannot randomly assign personal traits, and so we cannot interact them, but we can restrict the regression analysis to these cases. So at this point, I will end, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Tal, for keeping the time. Our next presentation is by Andre Rothschild, and he's from Nove Public Affairs. He will talk about challenges and opportunities for European reindustrialization at the age of the Green Deal. And Andre is joining us for Zoom. So Andre, the floor is yours, 12 minutes as before.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Good morning, all. I hope you can see my screen, hopefully. Yeah, you can. So good morning, all. So my name is Andre from Nove Public Affairs, Brussels-based consultancy, where basically what we do is to try to navigate EU companies and non-EU companies in the legislative jungle of the EU legislation. And also for me personally, it's great to be here because I'm an alumnus from the European firm at Hebrew University. So a great way to close the loop today. And today I would like to share with you a few thoughts from a business perspective on the relation between the reindustrialization of Europe and the Green Deal, because achieving a green transition has become since 2019, and the announcement of the EU Green Deal by President von der Leyen, a key driver of EU policies. She coined that as a man on the moon moment. And this was only 4 years ago. We marked a few days ago the first anniversary of it. But it seems it was a very different life and a very different world indeed. Because while many pieces of legislation of the Green Deal were being discussed, the coronavirus pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine moved the political focus to supply chain security and energy dependencies. And since then, basically, achieving strategic autonomy for the EU economy by promoting the reindustrialization of Europe and putting the emphasis on competitiveness has become an equally important EU policy priority. But greening the economy and making the EU more autonomous do not always overlap, because reindustrialization is which is driven by the desire to enhance economic resilience, often involves processes that historically contribute to environmental degradation. The Green Deal, on the other hand, demands a radical shift towards sustainability, requiring industries to minimize their carbon footprint and adopt eco-friendly practices. Conceptually, also the industrialization and environment objectives sound almost antagonistic, because when we think of industry as a concept, we think immediately of the 19th century English chimneys spitting coal in the air. And indeed, industry is associated with high carbon emissions and resource depletion. And this conception has also been supported in literature, notably by Charlie Chuan in his 2012 article on economic growth, industrialization, and the environment, where he shows that basically industrialization is a central determinant of changes in environmental quality. And he found that basically a 1% increase in industry's share of total output is associated with an almost 12% increase in the level of emissions per capita. Also now for industries and for companies, one primary concern associated with the Green Deal is the economic burden that comes with the transition toward greener practices. The stringent emission reduction targets and in the imperative to adopt cleaner technologies necessitate great investments, potentially straining the financial resources of companies, especially smaller ones. This is not something that only comes from the business perspective, but even the International Resource Panel in the report for the UN Environment Program stresses the importance of the economic burden on industries in that context. And the cost and technical challenges of implementing decarbonizing solutions will become a significant barrier and a threat to the competitiveness and viability of European industry, because meeting the Green Deal's goal will require, for example, for chemical companies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by almost 200 million tons in the next 3 decades, according to a recent study by Accenture. And because the industry has already made many steps, the next step will be even harder. And they will require companies to develop and adopt new technologies, reshape plant networks, halt operations at various plants for a significant period of times, and essentially transform an industry with hundreds of plants across Europe. The research found that altogether, the cost will be, in terms of investment, in the 1 trillion euros range. On top of that, very quickly to other challenges, the Green Deal's emphasis on circular economy principles is also likely to disrupt traditional linear production models, and which will also require significant adjustments in manufacturing processes and supply chain management, which will also lead potentially to increased operational costs. On top of that, the transition may also lead to job displacement in sectors heavily reliant on carbon-intensive practices, demanding comprehensive strategies for workforce retraining and social support. And very quickly, I would like to touch upon a topic that is quite often overlooked, and is the issue of compliance. Because speaking of boosting the competitiveness of EU industry, especially for SMEs, is almost an oxymoron in the context where nearly every proposal from the Commission during this term burden businesses with new bureaucratic requirements. We can mention, for example, the increase in reporting obligation through the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or the upcoming Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which will add heavy due diligence obligations, not only on companies directly covered by the directive, but also on a whole spectrum of companies in the value chain. And in literature, the concept of stringency relates to how difficult and costly it is for firms to comply with new requirements. According to Ashford in an 85 article on using regulation to change the market for innovation, stringency basically is the most important factor influencing technological innovation. And a regulation is just to be stringent if firms need to significantly change their behavior or develop new technology in order to comply. And this is quite the case with a lot of Green Deal pieces of legislation. So the increased regulatory burden on companies leads to rising compliance costs, and also will automatically require resources that could have been better spent on, for example, on developing new circular materials or low emission technologies. If we focus on SMEs, which is an important case because in Europe you have 24 million SMEs that represent 99% of all businesses and almost 2/3 of jobs in the private sector. So SMEs have been suffering a lot since the coronavirus pandemic, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because of the increasing cost of raw materials, the increasing cost of energy, and also the rise in inflation that basically reduces also access to finance for SMEs. But SMEs have in Europe on average 4 employees. And the increasing bureaucratic burden means that an increasing part of the time of these 4 employees is being dedicated to compliance tasks, which hinders not only the profitable time of the employees, but also the time they have to act on ESG. And compliance has been presented as a main challenge by a majority of SMEs in a recent Eurostat survey. So we have an issue there with SMEs and compliance. And it's not only about SMEs or classic industry. The issue is also present in tech. The European Tech Alliance just published a report according to which it's up to 30% of the resources of developers that are busy with complying with the rules. And obviously, those are resources that can be invested in innovation, in improving the service and the user experience. And so we arrived to this point where, on the one hand, the Commission wants Europe to become a leader in quantum, on AI, on semiconductors. But on the other hand, there are a lot of rules, especially those emanating from the Green Deal, seem to to become an obstacle to some extent. And these concerns also has reached decision makers, and we increasingly hear member states insisting that the next Commission should focus on detox in terms of regulation in order to enhance the competitiveness and the reindustrialization of Europe. Germany and France, they're pushing for a bureaucracy reduction action plan. And
Andre, you have 2 more minutes.
Yes, perfect. The Commission has also understood that and has proposed a plan of bureaucratic burden reduction by 25%, but it's more band-aid, right, on some issues. So I will run very quickly through the next slides on the link between regulation and innovation. I will pass quickly, just highlighting that kind of counterintuitively, sometimes regulation can be seen as a catalyst for innovation. The importance on the more positive side is that by prioritizing sustainability and environmental responsibility, the Green Deal also positions the European companies at the forefront of global trends toward eco-friendly practices, leading to market edge, basically. And very finally, we'll just touch upon uptakes from the case of 2 horizontal Green Deal pieces of legislation, so the reporting directive that we spoke about before, and the due diligence directive. Because also in a compliance, you have opportunities not only for the environment, but also for companies. So the reporting directive aims to ensure that companies publicly disclose adequate information about the risk, opportunities, and impacts of their activities on people and environment. So it's a big compliance hassle for companies. But what we see and what we also understand from companies is that the fact that you have standardized disclosure will also allow comparability and ease data availability for companies, which will also, allow companies to make better informed decisions. The sustainability reporting will also permit to attract more capital and funding because investors are increasingly focusing on sustainability performances in the assessment. And eventually, by reporting on CSRD, companies will also be able to better communicate externally on their sustainability strategy, which could also be beneficial for the reputation and the credibility of the company. Quickly on the due diligence, the same apply on access to finance and customers' trust if you want. But the fact that the due diligence directive focuses on the value chain will also on the value chain, but also on business partnerships and uses a risk-based approach, will also allow company to understand better the value chain and improve their own risk management and adaptability. So from that point of view, compliance would then not only be beneficial for the Green Deal's objective, but also increase the competitiveness of European companies under scope and support reindustrialization efforts. And I will stop here to keep the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. Our next speaker is Mark Luban from the Ministry of Finance, the Israeli Ministry of Finance. And he will talk about the future of the Euro area. Mark, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Hello, everybody. I'm Marc Luban from the Chief Economist Department at the Ministry of Finance. We are in a close working relationship with the Directorate General Eco-Finance at the EU Commission. And today I will say a few words about the future of the Euro area. What about the presentation?
Yes, what is it?
The future of the Euro.
Okay. Maybe you can simply share this a little bit.
Okay. Perfect. Perfect. So everyone is looking at the slides. So I just will start with a very general presentation. We are speaking about 20 countries. On January 1st, 23rd, Croatia was the last EU member country to join the EU area. So we are speaking about 344 million people who are using the euro. And also we're speaking about around 60 countries who are paying their monetary policy to the euro. So we are speaking about 500 million who are using on a daily basis the European currency. Okay. So it is a very important element from the single market, the European currency, and it reduced the cost of a transaction. And as we see here, it was, we see that there are many strategic sectors, many commodities from strategic sectors, the currency is labeled, or as I say, nominate in euro. I can mention the gas contract. I can mention the healthcare and aircraft commodities. Well, all transactions are done in euro. And what we find out that the reserve currency is going down from 25% in 2003 to 20%. And that's an interesting question, why the euro is going down at the bank reserve foreign currency. We thought at the Israeli Ministry of Finance that this is due to the yuan currency, which is going up. but that's just a supposition. So as I mentioned before, the EU, the euro area represent around 40.65% of the world GDP. As you know, currently today there are around 8 billion people on Earth, and the EU area represent only 344 million. So 15% of the world GDP is quite impressive. And as you see, the currency, the EU currency is as strong as the dollar today. Now, when we look at the performance of the 20 country member of the EU, we see that today we found out that there is 6 member countries where they are suffering a kind of sluggish economy. We also, the title of the Economist few weeks ago was asking if Germany is going to be the sick man of Europe. So technically, Germany today is in a kind of recession, and the reason there are many reasons. One of them is the Chinese, because the Germany depend on its export in China. The second one is the energy crisis, the inflation that result from that, and this represents also what's happened in other countries in Europe. I will mention Ireland, where they joined the Pillar 2 of the OECD, which means that they are going to raise the taxes on multinational. And as you know, the Ireland economy is dependent on the multinational. And when they will do that, many American firms are going to reshoring to the US. This is one of the main reasons why we find out there is a kind of recession in Ireland. Now, about the challenge. I mentioned the first challenge is the productivity growth. It's also a challenge here in Israel. And we believe that reforms to removing barriers to trade, permitting foreign suppliers to come more easily to the countries in Israel or in the EU, it's a good way to create competition. And competition can create productivity. About the difference between the EU member countries. So we have the German, it's a huge manufacturing economy. And from the other side, we have Ireland, for example, as I mentioned, it is a services economy. So we see a difference between the 20 member countries of the EU. About the supply chain, and I will connect this item with the next one, the great relocation. So as we suffer from the supply chain during the COVID-19. Then we have the war in Ukraine with the supply of grains from Ukraine via the Black Sea to other countries. And today we see what's happened in the Red Sea. So this is a huge challenge that we are all trying to find out a solution. I will mention that later on about that. The persistent challenge. So we have the climate change. It's a huge challenge for Europe and also for Israel and other countries because it represents a huge cost for the economies. We are speaking about investment in new infrastructure and, of course, investment in Green Deal, as was mentioned before. The aging population, it's a
Mark.
5 minutes. So I will continue. So we have the aging population challenge in Europe, and the answer should be the migration. We all know about the deal that was struck 2 days ago concerning the policy immigration, but they will have to manage to integrate more and more new immigrants to Europe because of this challenge. I will just say a few words about the war in Ukraine and war in the Middle East. which create a kind of uncertainty. We don't know what will happen in 24. We don't know if it will be a regional war in the Middle East or just limited to Gaza, and it will be, and of course, it will affect the supply chain as we see in the Red Sea. I mentioned China before, that many EU countries depend on their export to China. We can see how Germany is fully dependent with its export to China, and it is one of the reasons why they have a kind of economic problem. As you see, the Moody's rating agency downgrade the credit of China, and we find out that there will be a great problem in 24, 25 with this country. I will finish with a kind of positive remarks about the energy. We saw that Europe find out a solution to import liquefied gas from the US. They will invest a lot in green energy. And also we speak a lot with our Europe counterparts about the IMEC project that was initiated by the G20 in September. It's a kind of corridor, economic corridor, that will create a link between India, the Middle East, and Europe. And that will be a kind of solution to the bottleneck that we find out today, and also to a way to downgrade the prices of commodities. Okay, I think I will finish here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Ahead of time, so that's great. And last but not least, our final paper is by Hila Levy, and she will talk about the European Central Bank and the human consequences of austerity. I guess.
All right, thank you. So good morning. My name is Hila Levy from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and it is very nice to be here and engage after so long in some academic conference and activity. So this presentation is based on a paper that I am revising for the Journal of European Integration. And I will begin with a short background. I'll present the puzzle of the paper and then delve into several main themes of the paper. So a disclaimer I feel I should make here is that I am not an economist, and accordingly the paper is about economic institution, but from a socio-political perspective. So a brief overview of the interest in central banks. So as long as central banks executed their narrow mandate of price stability, social scientists' interest in their policies and decisions remained limited. Nevertheless, the global financial crisis that erupted in 2007 completely changed the conceptions on the role of central banks and sort of launched a new area of central banking. So today, central banks no longer focus on only influencing interest rates, but they employ many unconventional monetary policy tools to increase the effectiveness of monetary policy and ensure financial stability. And that their influence on the economy and the society grew significantly. And one of the most prominent examples for this is the European Central Bank. So in 2009, the ECB joins the Troika, an ad hoc authority with a mandate to manage the euro area crisis, and specifically the bailout programs to crisis countries. And thus the ECB broadened its role and responsibilities, going far beyond its original and official mandate of containing inflation. And the other members of the Troika, other than the ECB, were the IMF and the European Commission. And the ECB, as part of the Troika, actually sits in the negotiation table with crisis countries and engages in important decisions with profound human and social repercussions. So it gets involved in questions such as how much government should spend, which taxes should be raised, which wages should be cut, and which fiscal policies should be applied in the crisis countries in order to overcome the crisis. And without getting too much into the dynamics within the Troika members, I will only say that the ECB was very influential in this complex cooperation scheme and pushed for austerity. So the ECB, among these three institutions, was the one who was most in favor of the austerity measures. And regardless of its involvement and strong voice in the Troika, the ECB actually turned a blind eye towards the human and social implications of austerity. So we did not formulate any policy or any code of conduct to ensure that its crisis management strategy aligns with fundamental human necessities and social norms in the European Union. And this is remarkable given the duty of EU institutions and the ECB among them to respect fundamental rights and given EU's identity as a human rights protector. So the EU is a staunch defender of fundamental rights, but suddenly fundamental rights of millions of EU citizens were downplayed. And this observation constitutes the problematic of this research and served as the point of departure for this project. And building on literature and interviews with ECB officials that I conducted, this work suggests that organizational cultural features, such as the mainstream economic thinking widespread in the bank and the narrow mandate interpretation, by ECB's officials and employees. So this steers the bank toward overlooking the impact of its policies on the human and social level. And before presenting the explanation I suggest for this puzzle, I will devote a couple of minutes to explain why the ECB should even care about human and social consideration while managing the crisis or any crisis. And this is because the role of central banks in protecting human and social conditions is not at all intuitive. So first of all, although the ECB is a central bank created with a very narrow economic mandate and limited set of policy tools and high level of independence, it does not operate in a vacuum, but is part of the EU polity, which is founded on norms such as democracy, human rights, social solidarity, and good governance. So one would expect that the EU and its institution, again, the ECB among them, will comply with the norms it sets. And second, from a more legal perspective, so Article 127 of the Treaty of the European Union defines the ECB's basic tasks. And the primary objective, according to this article, is to maintain price stability, but it's not the only one. So the second part of this article, according to the second part, the ECB is also obliged to support the general economic policies in the Union with a view to contributing to the achievement of the objectives of the Union as laid in Article 3. So these objectives include actually the full employment, social justice, and protection, and more. So theoretically, I argue that the full legal mandate of the ECB could have provided more room for maneuver in tackling the crisis, paying attention also to these aspects. Nevertheless, the ECB largely neglected this part of its mandate and focused only on price stability. So getting back to the puzzle, there are several explanations in the literature to explain the ECB's conduct and lack of consideration of the human and social aspects of the management of the crisis. And I will only mention them and then move on to my explanation. So legal constraints, which focus on the limited mandate, economic rationality, who present the view that austerity was necessary and that there was no other way, and political factors, mostly discussing Germany's influence on the ECB's conduct in the crisis. I would not elaborate on each explanation due to the lack of time. And the aim of this research is actually to bring in one more explanation. So when the crisis erupted, the ECB found itself in a unique situation. It was not prepared to manage such a huge crisis. And in the absence of a clear legal and political framework for its increasing organizational role, the characteristic of the organization, namely its organizational culture, can actually set a benchmark for its conduct. And I will present quickly two organizational features of the ECB that seems to be important to explain the silence of the ECB regarding the social implications of austerity. So these were extracted from various studies on the ECB and also from the interviews I conducted with ECB officials. So the first one I want to refer to is the dominance of neoliberalism, which came in the shape of austerity. So the literature debates that were documented in press and interviews I conducted showed there was a very strong consensus in the bank that austerity was inevitable and the only possible solution to the crisis. In the context of the crisis, policies of austerity reflected the neoliberal conventional wisdom of how a crisis should be dealt with. And again, it should be highlighted here that austerity had a dramatic influence on the enjoyment of social and economic rights. Now, different economists and experts suggested different solutions, including members of the Troika, mainly the IMF, who suggested debt restructuring, but the ECB strongly advocated for austerity and was not willing to accept any other way. The interviews also revealed this encouragement to express different views regarding the crisis management within the bank. And my argument is that the dominant way of thinking of the institution and the policy prescriptions that resulted from it left no space to express alternative views or call for different solutions, including one that may take into consideration the human and social dimensions of the crisis. And the second feature I would like to refer to is the formal and narrow interpretation of the ECB mandate. So the ECB is a task-specific organization. The primary objective, as I already said, is to maintain price stability. But while many observers have noted that the ECB's activity was in fact broadened, the ECB argued all the while that it remained committed to its mandate of fighting inflation, and it was completely reluctant to go through any institutional broadening beyond its original mandate. And it interpreted all the measures it took as a legitimate tool used within the mandate constraints. And at the institutional level, the human and social cost of the crisis was not something addressed handled seriously within the ECB. So the ECB adopted a kind of easy logic. So if it's not in their mandate, they do not have to handle it. And of course, an institution that sees itself responsible for only a very specific and narrow task, and it interprets this task very narrowly, is likely to refrain from taking any meaningful steps in order to protect human rights. So to conclude, this paper offers a new point of analysis for understanding the management of the euro area crisis and tries to describe the ambience in which the ECB operated and took decisions, suggesting that all these have had an important influence on the ECB's behavior during the crisis. And the fact that the financial crisis became so often and widespread in recent decades underscores the vital importance of studying and comprehending central banks. And this study seeks to contribute to these efforts. And I will end up with an open question. So this panel is about EU economic institutions. But when it comes to the EU, economic institutions are actually so embedded in a broader context of the European Union as a whole, with social, political, and cultural aspects. So can a EU really be only economic without developing any agenda regarding human rights, environment, etc.? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hila, and all the speakers. We have about 15, 20 minutes for Q&A. So I would like to invite the audience who was sitting here very patiently and listening to ask questions or provide comments to the speakers. And if you could present yourself, and Tal, do you want to?
Just a minute. Yeah, in order for this to go into the recording, you have to speak into a mic that Yossi graciously provide you with.
And please introduce yourself before you ask the question. Thanks.
Hello, I'm João. I'm from Portugal. I'm studying here in the conflict resolution. I studied economics in the past, my bachelor's. I wanted to question a bit about the European Central Bank in recent years has been, especially following the crisis, is very conservative in its positions, financial positions. It is in turn transfers to the national banks. They are very protective, the lending. And do you think this over cautionary style is good for the environment? And how do you think this can be overcome? Because this in turn reflects in the innovation in the companies themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to collect a few more questions. We have Moshe there.
Good morning. I'm Moshe from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I have a question to Hila. It's very, very interesting, but as you started now that central banks or the ECB now tends to adopt now looser policy, monetary policy, is it related to a different organizational culture of the ECB? I mean, is it that now that the central figures in the ECB, they are less liberal, they are more Keynesians, or there is something else in the 5 parameters that you have presented? I mean, the parameters of organizational culture. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Rafi Barak, PhD student in Ben Gurion. For Hila, in a more constructivist way, to what extent the fact that Christine Lagarde was president of 2 of the 3 institutions that you mentioned, and what's the influence of France in fixing the policies that you describe? And to Mark, if you can elaborate a little bit about the influence of the war that we are going on now, and that you mentioned only very briefly, and our relations to Europe and the euro. And second question to you only, do we have in our services with Europe, in our financial services with Europe are open totally, or there are still things that you seem to think that we have to change on? Thank you.
Thank you. I will abuse my role as a chair and also ask a question. And the question is for Tal. So this is very interesting. I have a couple of thoughts or questions. First, I'm a bit confused about the level of analysis because it seems that your main argument is really about parties and governments, and then the actual research is at the individual level, right? The public. And I wasn't sure what the survey does for you in terms of actually understanding, the issue. It seemed that so there's some kind of a disconnect there, I think, between kind of the hypothesis at the party level of state level, member level, and what the public thinks about this issue. The second, I guess, so you have a lot of conditions, right? Which means you'll need a really large survey to actually. So I wonder whether that's wise. We want to manipulate all these conditions, which again, I think if you want to have valid results, you'll need lots of people. So maybe you have a lot of money and you're gonna do that. But I wonder whether you want to maybe narrow down a little bit all the conditions that you vary. So with that, let me turn to the speakers. Let's start with Hila, and then Mark, and then Carl. And then I'm not sure if Andre had, but if Andre wants to add something to them, you're welcome to do that. Hila.
So thank you very much for the questions. So I will refer to several points. So first of all, Moshe, organizational culture is sort of a stable category, but it's not static. So it does change. And we can see that it has been changed in the last decades since the Euro area, more than a decade again. And I think that the best example is the climate change. So regarding climate change, the ECB opened a climate change center, and it actually is very involved. And I think that it can be said that it has an agenda. So it invests in corporate bond purchase, green corporate bond purchase, and really getting involved in this topic. But I don't think that its culture has changed profoundly. But I think that there was kind of understanding in the institutions that in order to really tackle financial crisis, financial challenges, so it should be involved also in wider topics than price stability. And I think it was easier for the ECB to do so with climate change, which is less controversial than human rights and less problematic to apply and to implement and to monitor. So the culture did not change, but there is a process of organizational change and of more institutional change and legal and political change. And Rafi, I think this speaks also to your question. So management, again, also can be influential, but they do not change profoundly the culture. So there can be some small moderations and change that derive from the management, but the culture is a more wider concept which infuses all aspects, departments, and level of the organization.
I will start with the second issue that you mentioned about the financial services. It's a good question about our relationship with Europe concerning the financial services. As you know, the trade agreement that we have with the EU is from 95. It's only about industrial products and agricultures. And unfortunately, it doesn't include the services and especially financial services. So there's many trade regulation. There are many trade barriers to financial services suppliers. Today, currently, we are negotiating an agreement, a trade agreement with the UK that will include a specific chapter with regard to financial services. And it's quite tough for us. For us, when I say for us, I mean for the Ministry of Finance, because we have to negotiate not only with the UK, but also with 3 financial supervisors in Israel. We have the capital market institution and supervisor, with the Bank of Israel, and we have the Israeli Securities Authority. And And it's quite tough for us because each of them, they are looking on stability only. They are not looking about, they don't thinking about competitiveness. They are not open to the idea that there will be foreigner suppliers for financial services. They just want to have to use their prudential measures and to guarantee kind of protection to the customer, to the Israeli customer. This is their main objective. And it's quite tough for us, Ministry of Finance, to convince them to open the market for competition in order to lower the prices. I don't know what will be the result of this negotiation. The UK told us that they are very upset about our answers to their request. And we tried to create some mechanism to liberalize the market, but unfortunately, the Israelis are very protected. The way, I mean, the Israelis, I want to say the financial supervisors. So we will see. Hopefully in 24, we will have some change, but I'm not sure about it. Now, concerning the impact of the war in Israel about the euro. So when we discussed with our counterpart from the DG Eco-Finance, in October, they were discussed about the energy prices. They try to understand what will be they are afraid about the headlines inflation that will go up because of the prices of the energy. But now there is something new, as I mentioned, what's happening in the Red Sea. So this will influence the import of commodities from Asia to Europe. And this is why we are these days discussing about the project, the IMEC project. And I can tell you that even there is a war in Gaza, the Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries, they are keeping links with us. And we know that once the war will be ending, we are going to resume our discussion with regard to IMEX and other projects.
To your first question, Yoam, we theorize a triangular relationship between banks, governments, and citizens/voters. And this study simply focuses on a particular side of this triangle. It's the government-voter relationship within the context of this triangle. So I think it's not a disconnect. Voters, I mean, governments, parties, they have to be reelected. They're accountable to their voters. So whatever policies they have in general, in this case, on banking supervision, you want to find out whether it costs them anything. And it's an important question because, some people tell me, voters this is not what's on their mind when they go to the ballot, banking supervision. Or people would say that's true, but only when there's a crisis, or depending on how much they pay. So we think Germany is a country where people would be sort of minded to banking issue. It's the kind of place where you would expect culturally voters to be attentive to this. This would be, we find no null results there, then that could tell you to other places. The other question is about the complexity of the conjoint. It's a common criticism. It's not uncommon for conjoints to have 9 randomly assigned attributes. There's a whole literature that backs it up. Gary King and his fellows about showing that you can do this. When I tried this on people in Germany, not a real pilot, but just among my colleagues, what happens is life is complicated. When you go to the ballot, there could be a zillion issues over which you can cast your vote in the end. But what people end up doing is focusing on a small number of issues that they really care about and disregard the rest. So I expect people who answer this survey to, after the first screen, it takes them a while to study it, but then, and this also goes to the following questions you had about how many participants, we can repeat this 8 or 9 times. Each time they get a new pair of parties they have to choose from per one participant. And all this takes about 15 minutes in the end. Gal and I have tried it with another experiment where he really did run a pilot. So, each time, now that they're familiar with the screen and the same attributes appear in the same place in the screen, they're just randomly assigned values, they really focus on the 2-3 lines that they really care about. But in the regression analysis, after all these thousands of individual level observations, you get a response. You get a certain estimate of the average effect, and those that don't matter don't figure in the end. So I wanted to take an opportunity to ask Andre, are you still with us, Andre?
Yeah, I am.
Oh, good. I wanted to ask you something. There's a lot commentary and research about how China is leading in technology together with US, leaving the EU behind, such as electric cars, for example. But on the other hand, the European Union remains a major regulatory powerhouse, and it has affected regulation in many other places that want to do business in Europe because it's still a very important market. I wanted to ask you whether you think China is a regulatory satellite, if I would exaggerate things a bit, of Europe for all its might and for all of its technological progress. If it still has to comply with European regulation in order to sell them, in the end, is the European Union not the shaper of Chinese technology? To Hila, my question is, don't be upset, but you must be getting this right. Does culture matter? Or how much does it matter? Because culture is shaped by recruitment. There's a recruitment of new staff and staff, so that's a policy who you recruit, right? So you end up with a culture you want. And also, if you take the experience, for example, of the IMF staff saying, you should be tough with Greece, but then, the American Treasury being very upset and worried about what's going to happen if Greece will fall, sort of forcing the staff to revise their opinions. So there's a hierarchy there too. So I wonder how much that matters. Mark, I was intrigued by the data you provided about more and more gas contracts being invoiced in euros. There's, the old saying was that when the American dollar rose to supremacy, one important pillar of that was that they convinced Saudi Arabia to sell oil in dollars. It was an important backer of the international reserve status of the dollar. And now, I mean, you quoted mostly transaction flows. You reminded us that in reserves they're only 20%, the euro. But do you see this rising on account of the increasing role of gas versus oil in energy sources and foreign currency invoicing? Thanks.
Yeah, all right, fine.
I have a minor historical remark to Hila. I was surprised when you said that, in fact, the lack of empathy of ECB officials regarding social matters was due to their studying in the United States and having neoliberal theories in mind. I was surprised because I was expecting you to say that the ECB is based in Frankfurt, in Germany. In Germany, there is a long tradition of not being indebted. There is the Schuldenbremse, and they preach, in general, the Germans, more austerity than the French, let's put it like this. So I thought that your remark that it's the fault, say, of the Anglo-Saxons was misplaced, because in my opinion, if it is the fault, it is the fault of the Germans, the German tradition on banking, on central banking, and on debt, on Schuld, than the American one. Okay, what I would agree is that all Southern Europe and France, etc., are against these views, but I am not sure that the fault, or let's put it, it comes from the Anglo-Saxon world, but rather from Germans and Swiss. Okay.
Andre, would you like to respond to Tal's question?
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Tal, for the question. Indeed, to some extent, you can say that that the EU standards and the EU norms, let's say, are driving the world and innovation. But if you look, for example, at the more technical level, we see that in terms of standardization, like technical standards, we see a growing Chinese influence in international organizations, so the ISO, IASEI, the International Telecommunication Union. So we see that maybe at the higher level, indeed, the EU is trying to lead, but at the more technical level, we see a big Chinese influence, trying basically, as always with China, to strategically position their own nationals slash private companies. But I have to say that we also see a big pushback, and not only from China, but also from the US on the issue of the extraterritoriality of some EU pieces of legislation. This has been the case now with the due diligence directive, which again aims to establish a framework for a responsible approach to value chains. And basically, it will require companies to take steps to conduct due diligence on their own value chains and to mitigate risk, etc. And due to the extraterritorial nature of this directive, we've seen a big major pushback from many countries. So obviously in China, but also like-minded countries such as the US, the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said multiple times that it's becoming an issue. So we are seeing this lack of alignment growing, because on the one hand, yes, the EU is, as you said, is willing to lead by on the norms pitch, I would say. But on the other hand, many countries are starting to oppose that. And very quickly, just a reflection on I think a question from Barak on the role of France in the finance sector. We indeed see, I mean, it's not directly related to the ECB, but we see in the past years, and especially I think since Brexit, we see a very hawkish stance of France in finance and regarding the financial sector. And the latest example being, again, the due diligence directive. Provisional political agreement has just been found these days. And France has lobbied very hard to keep the financial sector, banks and investors out of the scope of the directive, against the position of the European Parliament, but against also the position of some member states, especially the Netherlands. So again, since Brexit, France is trying maybe to grab the place of the UK as a major financial place, and we see a very aggressive French strategy in that sector.
Okay, Hila, and then Mark.
Okay, thank you. So, Tal, yes, culture matters. But no, seriously, there is a huge debate between business management scholars and sociological approaches, whether culture matters and how it is created. So business scholars believe that culture can be engineered, manipulated, and so on. And sociologists approaches speaks about something that is created within a certain group of people, within certain atmosphere. So I apply in my research sociological approach, and I explain why. But again, the management that was raised before is another evidence that whenever manager is replaced, it does not change the culture profoundly, and organizational process and change is something very gradually that takes time and occurs over time. So yes, and also it is very intuitive, and you mentioned it also regarding Germany, that nations have culture. So why not other social units? But I will send you my paper. And for Alfred, so yes, the German fear from inflation is completely part of the story, but is again more maybe historical, but also it can also be a part of the cultural explanation. But I want to highlight the fact that the ECB is not a German institution, but a European institution. And Germany's influence on the ECB's conduct during the crisis was limited, and it has several time clashes between the ECB and German that were documented. And something that I want to stress is the ECB's employees. It's not a lack of empathy. So the other way around, because ECB's employees are actually European citizens, and many of them came from Italy, Greece, Portugal, and knew the consequences of austerity from very close, because they felt it in their home countries. But at the institutional level, so this is my focus, the institutional level, the organizational culture, their role perception did not allow them to develop any policy code of conduct at the institutional setting. But they were very, I think they had a lot of empathy. They had also from the interviews very sophisticated views that incorporate all the complexities of the crisis management, but their role perception, again, their culture, the way they are used to think about things, to handle challenges in their daily work, did not allow them to seriously engage with these topics.
Just one word. Just one word. You were asking why the contracts regarding the guides is using the euro. This is part of the Commission strategy. When they negotiate the contracts with foreign countries, they ask the request to pay in euro. And this is the response to your question.
All right. So this concludes our first panel, a very interesting panel. So thank you very much to the speakers and to the audience for your patience and interesting questions. And hopefully everything goes well for the rest of the day.